August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, as dawn broke over the Pacific. 11,000 United States Marines stormed ashore in what would become the first major Allied offensive against the Empire of Japan. Operation Watchtower marked a turning point in the Pacific War, but beyond the naval battles and jungle combat that followed, an unexpected weapon emerged in the dense darkness of the islands. Perimeter, one rooted not in steel or explosives, but in the fundamental structure of human language itself. The challenge was immediate and deadly. Serious, in the chaos of jungle warfare where visibility dropped to mere feet in dense tropical vegetation where the enemy spoke English and sometimes wore captured American uniforms, how could centuries at checkpoints distinguish between friendly forces and Japanese infiltrators attempting to penetrate American lines under cover of darkness? The answer came from an unlikely source. The pronunciation of a single letter. Master Technical Sergeant James W. Hurlbut, a combat correspondent with the United States Marine Corps Reserve, landed with the assault forces on August 7 in a March 10, 1943 interview. Preserved in naval records, Hurlbut provided direct testimony about the security measure that became standard practice during the campaign. His words offer the clearest primary source evidence we possess about pronunciation testing in the Pacific Theater. We always had passwords including the letter L. Hurlbut explained because L was thought to be hard for the Japanese to pronounce since there is no L in the Japanese vocabulary. This simple observation reflected a sophisticated understanding of linguistic limitations that would prove invaluable for American security throughout the campaign. Hurlbut noted one crucial limitation that revealed its real-world application. The tests sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese soldiers, indicating that Marines were encountering infiltrators with varying levels of English proficiency and that the measure, while effective, was not foolproof. By 1600 hours 400 p.m. on August 8, Marines had captured the nearly completed Japanese airfield. The error strip, initially designated Lunga Airfield by the Japanese, was renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The airfield became operational when the first PBY Catalina flying boat landed on August 12, and by August 20 the permanent air contingent arrived with 31 aircraft. Control of this airfield became the focal point of the entire 6-month campaign, with Japanese forces launching repeated attempts to recapture it. Security around Henderson Field and the defensive perimeter became paramount, Japanese forces demonstrating the tactical flexibility and determination that characterized their operations throughout the Pacific War. Attempted numerous infiltration operations. They moved through the jungle at night, sometimes in small groups, sometimes individually, seeking to gather intelligence, sabotage equipment, or misdirect American forces. The nighttime environment created perfect conditions for infiltration. Sentries posted at checkpoints around the perimeter had to make split-second decisions about whether approaching figures were friendly Marines or enemy infiltrators. Traditional identification methods proved inadequate in these conditions. Documents could be captured or forged. Uniforms could be taken from casualties. Physical appearance was difficult to verify in darkness. Even voices could be deceptive, as some Japanese soldiers spoke English with varying degrees of fluency. The Marines needed a method that could not be easily counterfeited, something that revealed identity through characteristics the infiltrator could not consciously control. The solution lay in exploiting the phonological structure of the Japanese language. To understand why this approach proved so effective, we must examine the fundamental differences between Japanese and English sound systems. Japanese possesses one liquid phone represented in standard Hepburn romanization as R, but pronounced quite differently from either the English R or English L sound. Linguistically, this Japanese liquid is classified as an aco-alveolar tap, represented in the International Phonetic Alphabet as R. Native Japanese speakers produce this Sound by quickly tapping the tongue against the alveolar ridge, the area just behind the upper front teeth, English by. Contrast has two distinct liquid phonemes. The English L sound is a lateral approximate produced by placing the tongue tip firmly against the alveolar ridge while allowing air to flow around the sides of the tongue. The American English R sound is quite different, typically produced as a postal viola approximate with the tongue pulled back and not touching the roof of the mouth at all. These two English sounds occupy distinctly different positions in the phonetic space, easily distinguished by native English speakers but falling within a single perceptual category for Japanese speakers. This philological difference is not a matter of physical inability or hearing impairment. Japanese speakers can physically produce both English sounds with proper training, and they can hear the acoustic differences between them when sounds are presented in isolation. The difficulty is perceptual and categorical. The Japanese language processes both English sounds through a single phonetic category established during early childhood language acquisition. When Japanese speakers hear English R and L sounds in actual speech, their brains automatically categorize both sounds as instances of the single Japanese liquid phone. Research conducted during and after World War II confirmed this phenomenon. Studies by Gudo in 1971, Miyake and colleagues in 1975, and Takagi and Mann in 1995 documented that Japanese speakers struggled to perceive the English R and L distinction even after extended exposure to English. Takagi and Mann found that Japanese speakers who had lived in the United States for more than 12 years still had significantly more difficulty identifying R and L sounds than native English speakers. The 1975 Milwaukee study revealed something particularly relevant to the wartime application, when researchers manipulated recordings of R and L sounds to make them sound less speech-like by removing certain acoustic information. Japanese speakers could distinguish them as well as native English speakers. This proved that the difficulty was not in hearing the acoustic differences but in how the brain processed those differences as linguistic sounds. For military security purposes, this linguistic reality meant that Japanese soldiers attempting infiltration faced a nearly insurmountable obstacle. Even soldiers who had studied English extensively, who might know vocabulary and grammar, who could maintain a conversation in English, would betray themselves through pronunciation of words containing L sounds. The pronunciation was not under conscious control. Under stress, fatigue, or time pressure, automatic native language pronunciation patterns would emerge regardless of the infiltrator's intentions or preparation. The effectiveness of this approach relies on how humans acquire language during early childhood, when the brain develops perceptual categories for native language sounds that remain remarkably stable throughout life and resist modification even with extensive adult training. The Marines implemented this knowledge through challenge words containing multiple L sounds. According to Hurlbut's testimony and available documentation, passwords systematically incorporated the letter L specifically because Japanese speakers would struggle to pronounce it correctly. When a sentry challenged an approaching figure with a password containing L sounds, a native English speaker would pronounce it automatically and correctly. A Japanese speaker, even one with good English, would typically substitute sounds closer to the Japanese liquid, producing something that sounded distinctly wrong to the trained ear of the sentry. One specific word has entered the historical record, though it comes from a single source. Oliver Garling, a journalist with the Associated Press, published "Free Men Are Fighting the Story of World War II" in 1942 with Farah and Reinhardt. On page 315, Garling wrote that Japanese soldiers would sometimes approach checkpoints posing as American or Filipino military personnel. He stated that sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza, and if the first two syllables come back as roar, the sentry would open fire without waiting to hear the remainder. The word Lollapalooza represents an ideal choice for this purpose if it was indeed Used, an American slang term meaning something outstanding or extraordinary. It contains four L sounds in rapid succession at the beginning of syllables, Lollapalooza. For a Japanese speaker, each of these L sounds would present difficulty, making it virtually impossible to pronounce the word correctly without extensive training. The instruction to listen specifically to the first two syllables makes tactical sense as well. A sentry would not need to wait for the complete password to identify mispronunciation, reducing exposure time during the challenge. However, we must be precise about the evidence. Garling's book is the only known source for Lalua. Specifically, the book was published in 1942, making it contemporary to the events. In Garling was a credible journalist with access to military sources, but no independent corroboration appears in official Marine Corps after-action reports, operational histories, or other memoirs from participants. Richard Trigascus' Guadalcanal diary, published in 1943 and based on his time as a war correspondent on the island, does not mention the specific word. Robert Leckie's memoir Helmet for My Pillow and other first-person accounts similarly do not reference it. What we can state with certainty is that L-based passwords were systematically used, as confirmed by Hurlbut's direct testimony. Whether Lollapalooza was one of those passwords remains plausible but not definitively proven. The word fits the tactical requirements, appears in a contemporary source, and aligns with the documented practice, but additional corroboration would strengthen the claim. The 6-month campaign lasted from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943. When Japanese forces successfully evacuated their remaining troops from the island, during this period the Marines and later Army forces who reinforced them faced constant pressure from Japanese attempts to retake the airfield. Major battles included the Battle of the Tenaru on August 21, the Battle of Edson's Ridge on September 12 to 14, and the Battle for Henderson Field on October 23 to 26. Throughout these engagements and in the periods between them, security around the American perimeter remained critical. Japanese infiltration tactics were well documented. Japanese soldiers, often working in small groups or individually, would attempt to penetrate American lines at night. They employed excellent camouflage, often attaching jungle vegetation to their uniforms. They moved with remarkable stealth through terrain they had studied carefully. Some spoke English, and instances were recorded of Japanese forces attempting to impersonate American personnel. The threat was real and persistent. Hurlbut also noted in his interview an interesting additional security indicator. On at least one occasion, a sentry detected Japanese infiltrators because they used grammar that was much too precise for the average Marine. One infiltrator reportedly said, "Hold your fire, we are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities," prompting the sentry to fire immediately because I knew no Marine would talk that way. In this context, pronunciation testing provided a reliable method for identifying infiltrators that did not depend on visual confirmation, proper documentation, or even extended conversation. A simple challenge with an L-ound word could expose an infiltrator in seconds. The test worked precisely because it exploited something the infiltrator could not easily fake: the automatic pronunciation patterns established during childhood language acquisition. The term shibboleth itself comes from the Hebrew Bible, from Judges 12, 5-6, where the Gileadites identified enemy Ephraimites by their inability to pronounce the word correctly. The Ephrates pronounced it Sith without the Esh sound, revealing their tribal identity. Similar linguistic tests have appeared throughout military history whenever forces needed to distinguish friend from foe and language differences provided a reliable marker. The D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, used a different linguistic principle for the same purpose. The challenge and password system employed flash as the challenge, thunder as the password, and welcome as the countersign. These words were chosen specifically because they contained sounds that German speakers found difficult. The Voiceless dental fricative thief sound in thunder does not exist in German, and the voiced labial va approximate W sound in welcome is also absent from standard German phonology. This parallel use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theater demonstrates that military forces recognized the value of exploiting phological differences for security purposes. Other English phonetic features that Japanese speakers found difficult included the English V sound, which does not exist in Japanese and is typically pronounced as B. The TH sounds both voiced and voiceless, and the English vowel system, which contains many more distinct vowel sounds than the 5 vowels of Japanese. Security-conscious password selection could exploit any of these differences, though the LR distinction appears to have been the most commonly used based on available testimony. The broader context of security measures in the Pacific Theater provides additional perspective. American forces throughout the Pacific faced persistent challenges with infiltration, deception, and the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in conditions where visual identification was often impossible. The challenge and password system used by military forces worldwide became even more critical in the Pacific due to several factors unique to that theater. First, the jungle environment of most Pacific battlefields reduced visibility dramatically. Dense vegetation, heavy rainfall, and the frequent use of nighttime operations by Japanese forces meant that sentries often had to make identification decisions based on sound and verbal communication alone. Second, Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized infiltration, night operations, and attacks that sought to create maximum confusion and chaos. The challenge and password system itself has a long military history. In principle, it is simple. A sentry issues a challenge, typically a single word. The person being challenged must respond with the correct password. If the password is wrong or not given, the sentry takes appropriate action. The effectiveness of this system depends on several factors. The challenge and password must be changed regularly to prevent compromise. They must be distributed to all friendly forces while being kept from the enemy, and ideally they should be chosen to make correct pronunciation by enemy forces difficult. The Military Intelligence Service Language School provides an interesting counterpoint to the pronunciation testing story. Established on November 1, 1941 at the Presidio of San Francisco, MSU moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942. Following Executive Order 966, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans from West Coast areas, the school later relocated to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in August 1944 and operated until June 1946. Missiles trained over 6,000 Japanese American soldiers as translators, interpreters, and intelligence specialists during the war. These second-generation Japanese Americans served throughout the Pacific Theater, providing critical language support for interrogations, document translation, and intelligence operations. The contribution of these Japanese American linguists was essential to Allied success in the Pacific. They interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents, intercepted and translated radio communications, and provided cultural insights that helped commanders understand Japanese military thinking. Their service was particularly notable given that many of their families were confined in internment camps while they fought for the United States. For pronunciation testing purposes, these Japanese American soldiers would have passed any L-based challenge automatically. They spoke English with native pronunciation, having acquired the language during childhood in American communities. Their presence in the Pacific Theater, while invaluable for intelligence work, also meant that security forces needed to be aware that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically indicate enemy status. Private First Class Eugene B. Sled provides one of the few verified personal accounts from an individual who served in the Pacific Theater and later documented his experiences. Sledge enlisted in the Marines and served with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He participated in the battles of Paolu, and Okinawa, fighting in some of the most intense combat of the Pacific War. His memoir With the Old Breed at Pelu and Okinawa, published in 1981, became recognized as one of the finest first-person accounts of infantry combat. While Sledge did not serve at Guadalcanal during the campaign, he arrived there in 1944 for training after the fighting had concluded. His book does not specifically mention pronunciation testing, focusing instead on the brutal realities of combat, the psychological toll of sustained fighting, and the experiences of Marine infantrymen in the Pacific. The absence of extensive discussion of pronunciation testing in most combat memoirs is itself informative. If the practice was as systematic and elaborate as some popular accounts suggest, we would expect more frequent mentions in the dozens of memoirs written by veterans. The relative silence suggests that while LBS'd passwords were used, as Hurlbut confirms, the practice may have been more limited or routine than later accounts implied. Security procedures that work effectively often become unremarkable to those using them daily. The eventual Allied victory came at significant cost. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 killed and over 8,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were much higher, with estimates of approximately 31,000 killed, many from disease and starvation, as American naval and air forces interdicted Japanese supply efforts. The successful Japanese evacuation in February 1943 saved approximately 10,000 Japanese troops who were later deployed elsewhere, but the strategic defeat was clear. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. The limitations of pronunciation testing should also be acknowledged. As Hurlbut noted, it sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese. Any Japanese individual who had spent childhood years in an English-speaking environment would have acquired native pronunciation and could pass LBS tests. Japanese intelligence services were aware of this advantage and occasionally employed individuals with English background for intelligence operations. Additionally, in the chaos of combat with artillery fire, explosions, and shouting, subtle pronunciation differences might be difficult to detect reliably. The test also carried risks of false positives. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from diverse backgrounds, including Filipino scouts and soldiers, Chinese Americans, and others whose English might carry non-standard pronunciations or accents. Security procedures needed to account for legitimate variation in English pronunciation among Allied forces. The phonological differences between Filipino languages and Japanese meant that Filipino English speakers typically had no difficulty with eel and ear sounds, as these phonemes exist in Tagalog and other Philippine languages. But their English might sound different from American pronunciation in other ways. Despite these limitations, pronunciation testing based on L sounds represented an elegant solution to a genuine security problem. It exploited real philological differences, required no special equipment, could be administered quickly, and provided a reasonable basis for identification when other methods were unavailable or unreliable. The test worked because it accessed something fundamental about language acquisition: the fact that phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life and are difficult to modify even with extensive training and conscious effort. The story of pronunciation testing serves multiple purposes today. For historians, it provides insight into the practical details of security operations during the Pacific War. For linguists, it illustrates real-world applications of philological knowledge. For general audiences, it offers a fascinating example of how language itself can become a tool in warfare. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to be careful about historical claims and to distinguish between well-documented facts and later embellishments. The verified core of the story is clear and compelling. American forces at Guadalcanal used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators who would struggle to pronounce those sounds correctly. This practice was documented by participants Makes excellent sense given the philological differences between Japanese and English, and represented practical innovation in the face of genuine security challenges. The specific word Lalua appears in one contemporary source and fits the pattern perfectly. Though independent corroboration would strengthen the claim, beyond this verified core, many popular accounts have added details that cannot be confirmed, invented statistics that appear nowhere in historical records, an attribution of the practice to a systematic Pacific-wide program for which no documentation exists. These embellishments, while making for dramatic storytelling, distort the historical record and create false impressions about the nature and extent of pronunciation testing. The honest history based solely on verified evidence is remarkable enough without embellishment. It shows American forces adapting to the challenges of jungle warfare, exploiting linguistic differences to improve security, and innovating at the tactical level to address immediate threats. It demonstrates the value of observation, practical intelligence, and willingness to try new approaches, and it provides a window into the daily realities of combat operations in the Pacific theater, where security, identification, and the constant threat of infiltration created persistent challenges for American forces. Marines who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. While the broader context of the campaign reminds us of the human cost of war and the complexity of military operations, the Japanese-American linguists who served in the Pacific, often while their families remained in internment camps, demonstrated loyalty and professionalism. Under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, their contribution to victory was essential, and their story adds depth and nuance to our understanding of the Pacific War. In conclusion, the verified historical record shows that American Marines at Guadalcanal systematically used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators. This practice, directly testified by combat correspondent James Hurlbut, exploited real philological differences between Japanese and English. The word Lollapalooza appears in one credible 1942 source as an example of such passwords. While broader claims about systematic Pacific-wide testing cannot be verified, the documented use at Guadalcanal demonstrates practical tactical innovation that addressed genuine security challenges. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, including security procedures like pronunciation testing, informed American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Each subsequent campaign saw improvements in tactics, logistics, and operational coordination. The amphibious assaults that followed from Tarawa through the Marianas, the Philippines, Islay, and Okinawa built on the foundation of experience gained at Guadalcanal. While we cannot document pronunciation testing at these later battles with the same certainty as at Guadalcanal, the principle of exploiting language differences for security purposes remained sound. The scientific understanding of phonology and language acquisition that explained why pronunciation testing worked came later through research conducted during and after the war. But the Marines at Guadalcanal did not need to understand the linguistic theory to recognize that Japanese speakers had difficulty with English L sounds, and that this difficulty could be used to identify infiltrators. This represents the best kind of practical knowledge, observations derived from experience and applied to solve immediate problems. The broader implications of this wartime application extend beyond military history. The recognition that language features can serve as reliable identifiers has influenced security procedures in subsequent conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American forces used similar principles, though adapted to different linguistic contrasts. In more recent conflicts, linguistic analysis has become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating voice, stress analysis, and dialect identification technologies that extend well beyond simple pronunciation testing. The ethical dimensions of pronunciation testing merit consideration as well. Unlike some security measures that relied on deception or caused physical harm, pronunciation testing was essentially diagnostic. It identified linguistic background without causing harm beyond the security consequences of failed identification. Soldiers who passed the test suffered no ill effects. Those who failed it were identified as potential infiltrators, not through arbitrary discrimination, but through objective phonetic evidence that they lacked the linguistic background they claimed. This relatively benign nature of the testing compared to more violent or coercive security measures meant that it remained acceptable within the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. The test also highlights an important principle about identity and ethnicity. Japanese Americans serving in the Pacific, such as those with the military intelligence service, passed pronunciation tests automatically because their linguistic identity was American regardless of their ethnic heritage. This demonstrated that pronunciation testing was fundamentally a measure of language background rather than ethnicity or race. It was the correlation between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language background, not ethnicity itself, that made the testing effective for identifying enemy infiltrators. This distinction, while perhaps not fully articulated during the war, had important implications for understanding the relationship between language, identity, and security. The human dimension of the Guadalcanal campaign extends beyond tactics and security measures. The men who fought there, both American and Japanese, displayed courage, determination, and adaptability in one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. The Americans who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation. The Japanese soldiers who faced these measures were themselves skilled and determined fighters, operating under extremely difficult conditions, fighting thousands of miles from home with increasingly tenuous supply lines. The post-war research into the phonetic phenomena that made pronunciation testing effective has enriched our understanding of how humans acquire and process language. Linguists and cognitive scientists, many of whom had served in military intelligence during the war, conducted extensive studies of second language pronunciation acquisition. Research by linguists like Patricia Kuhl and others demonstrated that infants are born with the ability to distinguish phonetic contrasts from any human language, but that this universal ability narrows during the first year of life as the brain specializes for the phonetic categories of the native language. This neural commitment to native phonetic categories, while essential for efficient language processing, creates exactly the kind of limitations that made pronunciation testing effective during the war. Adult Japanese speakers trying to master English L and R sounds were not simply learning new articulations, they were attempting to rewire neural perceptual categories that had been established decades earlier, a task that cognitive science has since shown to be extremely difficult and often impossible to complete fully. The pronunciation testing used during World War II also influenced linguistic research into the concept of foreign accent. Before the war, accented speech was often viewed simply as incorrect pronunciation that could be fixed through practice and instruction. Post-war research revealed that foreign accent reflects deep structural differences in phonetic processing, not simple errors. This understanding led to more sophisticated approaches to language teaching and to recognition that adult language learners, despite best efforts, will almost always retain some accent features from their native language. For military security, this meant that pronunciation testing would remain a viable identification method in future conflicts where language differences between forces could be exploited for security purposes. The principle has been applied in various forms in subsequent conflicts, though modern technology has added tools like voice stress analysis and linguistic profiling that extend well beyond simple pronunciation testing. The case of Technical Sergeant Paul Yamamoto, a name we cannot verify through historical records but which represents the thousands of Japanese Americans who did serve, illustrates the complex dynamics of pronunciation Testing in a war where American forces included Japanese Americans serving loyally despite the internment of their families. These Nisi soldiers who had grown up speaking English demonstrated through their native pronunciation that linguistic identity could cross ethnic lines. Conversely, Japanese soldiers who attempted infiltration revealed through their non-native pronunciation that linguistic identity was not determined by ethnicity but by developmental language exposure. The summer of 1945 brought preparations for what many expected would be the final bloodiest phase of the Pacific War. The potential invasion of the Japanese home islands would have placed American soldiers in an environment where enemy infiltration would be even more challenging to detect than on Pacific Islands. Japanese forces would have access to unlimited local resources, civilian clothing, and potential support from the civilian population. In this environment, reliable identification procedures would have been absolutely critical. Plans were developed for comprehensive security protocols that would have combined pronunciation testing with extensive documentation requirements, physical identification measures, and restricted movement zones. The protocols anticipated that even with pronunciation testing, some Japanese individuals with childhood exposure to English or exceptional linguistic abilities might attempt infiltration. Multi-layered security would provide redundant verification to catch even sophisticated infiltration attempts. These plans were never fully implemented due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they represented the culmination of years of evolution in linguistic security measures. The post-war period saw the declassification of many documents related to security procedures in the Pacific. The publication of these materials in subsequent decades provided fascinating insights into various aspects of Pacific war operations. Historians found extensive documentation of the development, implementation, and effectiveness of various security measures, though specific documentation of pronunciation testing remained limited primarily to the Hurlbut testimony and the Gramling reference. The story reminds us that military success depends on countless small innovations developed by those facing immediate problems and finding practical solutions. The recognition that language differences could be exploited for identification purposes demonstrated practical intelligence and tactical flexibility. The systematic use of LBSD passwords at Guadalcanal, while perhaps not as elaborate as some popular accounts suggest, represented genuine innovation that addressed a real security challenge. Today, the story of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal stands as a small but significant chapter in the larger history of the Pacific War. It illustrates how language, that most human of characteristics, can become a factor in warfare. It shows how understanding differences between languages can provide tactical advantages, and it demonstrates that success in warfare often comes from combining large strategic decisions with countless small tactical improvements developed by soldiers facing immediate problems. The historical record, when examined carefully and honestly, reveals both the achievements and limitations of pronunciation testing as a security measure. It worked at Guadalcanal, providing centuries with a quick and reliable method for identifying potential infiltrators. It made perfect sense given the linguistic realities of Japanese and English phonological systems, but it was not a perfect system, not a comprehensive Pacific-wide program, and not the elaborate operation that some popular accounts have suggested. By understanding what the evidence actually shows and being clear about the limits of that evidence, we honor the memory of those who fought in the Pacific while maintaining the intellectual honesty that proper history requires. The Marines at Guadalcanal faced extraordinary challenges in one of the first major American offensive operations of the Pacific War. Their innovation in developing practical security measures like pronunciation testing alongside their courage, combat, and their determination in holding Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks contributed to a strategic victory that changed the course of the Pacific War. the verified core of the story remains. Powerful, American forces exploited fundamental differences in how Japanese and English speakers produce and perceive liquid consonant sounds to create a security measure that was simple, effective, and difficult to counterfeit. This application of linguistic knowledge, whether derived from conscious understanding or practical observation, represented exactly the kind of tactical innovation that contributed to Allied victory in the Pacific.